So this week, Trump has met with Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro. I think it's pretty clear after this trip that Trump's best friend in the world stage, even more so than Netanyahu, is probably Bolsonaro. Even though Netanyahu's made it clear that he's never been closer with another U.S. president other than Trump, I think that the chemistry between Trump and Bolsonaro is pretty undeniable. And as we've come to learn, when it comes to Trump, the most important thing for him is his personal chemistry with someone. That determines whether he's willing to work with someone or not. And if Bolsonaro's got any brains, he realizes this himself, and he was prepared. I think that's why he brought most of his cabinet ministers to the U.S. for this trip. He's certainly looking to make a lot of deals. And so far, it sounds like he and Trump have made tremendous progress in narrowing the gap between Brazil and the U.S. Since the end of the Cold War and the democratization of Brazil, the U.S. and Brazil have had a bit of a tenuous relationship. You see, during the Cold War, the U.S. was very concerned about Brazil turning communist, and they supported a rather brutal military junta, which executed a lot of civilians without due process and was generally pretty oppressive. Now, Bolsonaro is the first president that I know of elected in Brazil since the end of the Cold War, who is actually a fan of the old junta. So that means that he's not necessarily upset with the United States for supporting the junta. He's actually quite happy and sees the U.S. as an ally against left-wing Brazilians. Therefore, if Bolsonaro wants to defend against his left flank, what he needs to do when he's on this trip here is he needs to make sure that he links Brazil to the U.S. as closely as possible, because the closer Brazil is to the U.S., the more influence the U.S. will have over Brazilian politics, and as he sees it, the more difficult it will be for real left-wingers to win in Brazil. For example, on this trip, they're trying to hammer out, or at least they're considering hammering out, a favorable trade deal between Brazil and the U.S., so that American companies will go down and invest in Brazil. Well, the more American companies you have invested in Brazil, the greater interest U.S. companies have there financially, the more they will care about Brazilian politics, and corporations tend not to like left-wingers, the kinds of people who would run against Bolsonaro. Essentially, Bolsonaro is trying to link his personal political interests and his general political philosophy with the interests of the United States government. One of the two even used the term North-South axis, referring to Brazil and the U.S. as sort of the closest allies in the Western Hemisphere. So it's undoubtedly clear at this point that Bolsonaro's goal during his presidency is to bring Brazil clearly within the U.S. sphere of influence in the way that Colombia or South Korea is. Trump even suggested that U.S. space exploration companies like SpaceX should set up some sort of Cape Canaveral-type facility down in Brazil because he said it was a great place to launch rockets. I'm not quite sure what that means or what's wrong with Florida. So the biggest piece of solid news out of this press conference that Trump and Bolsonaro did is that Trump has decided to designate Bolsonaro a major non-NATO ally. Now, what does this mean? This essentially means that Brazil will be as close to being in NATO as possible, but they don't have to go through the very strenuous NATO approval process, which has to be approved by every other NATO member state, and probably wouldn't be approved by the Eurocrats, because in Europe they don't like people like Bolsonaro. Now, major non-NATO ally status is also the status carried by Colombia, and it allows Brazil and Colombia then to have sort of favorable deals when purchasing U.S. weapons, so they could get some more Boeing planes and Raytheon bombs and Colt rifles and all these things. Now, in the past, Bolsonaro has floated allowing Trump to open a U.S. military base in Brazil, which would be a major step towards cementing U.S. influence. I would say that that's probably the final step, because once you have a U.S. base in your country, you really can't go against the U.S. because the troops are right there. They can march into your capital anytime they want, so you better not screw with them. For example, if Venezuela had a U.S. military base when Hugo Chavez was elected, Hugo Chavez would not have served out his full term. The Bolivarian Republic would not have lasted 20 years as it has. It would have been snuffed out pretty quickly. If Chavez would have even been able to be elected at all, which he probably wouldn't have if the U.S. had a stronger presence in that country. Again, Bolsonaro understands this. He knows that if he's able to get U.S. troops in there, that there's not going to be anyone too radical to the left elected into his country. Now, I think he probably overestimates the willingness of the U.S. to intervene in his country, so it's not like someone of his ilk is going to be elected every time in Brazil. As we see, there are left-wing people who can get elected in U.S. allied countries. For example, President Moon of South Korea is not exactly a big fan of having U.S. troops in South Korea, but he still got elected. Moon, however, is far from a communist. He's not going to start nationalizing industries. So what this means in the long run is that if Bolsonaro is successful and is able to get a U.S. base in Brazil, if he's able to get favorable trade deals and have heavy investment by U.S. corporations in Brazil, if he's able to achieve major non-NATO ally status, then Brazil will never end up like Venezuela. It will never end up like Zimbabwe. It'll never end up like Iran. Well, Iran is pretty well off, to be honest. They just don't get along with the U.S. But you'll never have a hostile government that doesn't like the U.S. in Brazil ever again. Because once the U.S. has sunk its teeth into a country, it doesn't let go. I mean, you see the Korean conflict was in the 50s, but there's still troops in South Korea. World War II was back in the 1940s. There's barely any World War II veterans alive, but yet we still have troops, 33,000 troops in Germany. Now, one more note about Venezuela. Bolsonaro has said that he will not commit Brazilian troops to any invasion of Venezuela, but he has not ruled out allowing the U.S. To use Brazil as a staging ground for their invasion of Venezuela. If that's the case, then that would be an excellent opportunity for Trump to establish a base in Brazil. In which case, Bolsonaro would probably be very open to allowing Trump to use Brazil as a staging ground to invade Venezuela, because then they're both getting something out of the deal then. Bolsonaro gets his base and Trump gets to invade Venezuela, and of course, after the invasion of Venezuela and the overthrow of Maduro, there probably will be a U.S. base established in Venezuela. So then you'll have Colombia, Brazil, and Venezuela, all three being very strong U.S. allies in perpetuity. So in other words, a lot is riding right now on Bolsonaro's trip to the U.S. and his visit with Trump this week. So we'll just have to stay tuned to see what else happens. If you got anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and subscribing. I do upload every day, so I'll see you tomorrow.